What's going on, everybody? We got another episode of Men of Now today. Unfortunately, Joel could not make it, but I have Mr. Jaren Scott. How are you doing, Jaren?
I'm doing fantastic. How about yourself?
Oh, I'm doing good. And from that last episode that we did when we were talking about how you close at airports, I was like, we got to dive a little bit more in depth into it because it is. I've experienced it myself, and most people don't talk about it, but it really is. It's cool. It's cool, and especially if you have to travel for business or if you're even just traveling for pleasure, it's like icing on the cake.
Yeah, how do you want to dive into this? Maybe why it's such a powerful skill set to develop, or why, like, I've always, it's not something I set out to develop personally. Like, okay, I got to get good at airport game. I just, in my 20s at one point, I went on a streak of being sat next to hot chicks, and then as my game got better, I realized, like, oh, this chick's like kind of into me. She's kind of giving me IOIs. And at first, I'd start the conversation too late and then be like, hey, like, I live in Mexico City. You can see it out the window here. So like, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I don't know where I'm staying. Or, oh, I gotta take off in the morning. Like, oh, cool. Like, let's hang out or come stay with me. And there's one girl one time, as we're getting off the flight, I finally started talking to her in a few minutes. I'm like, hey, like, come stay with me. She's like, I wish you would have said that like 20 minutes ago. She's like, I literally just texted my aunt to stay with her for the night because I have to be out in the morning. She's like, I totally would have stayed with you. Like, pretty much, like, she was kind of angry too. She's like, and they're a little conservative down here too. She's like, I can't bail out like saying yes to my aunt that I'm like go with some guy I just met on the airplane. Like, that just doesn't work here. So I got better at, I always say, I was recently on a trip in Europe with my brother, and sometimes he's good at game too, naturally, but sometimes, we like train station or transitional spaces, airports, and we'll get into why that's important. He'd be like, oh, I don't know, should I talk to that girl? Like, what if she's on a different flight? I'm like, dude, always shoot your shot. So like, even if you don't get laid like at the airport or that day, or don't do an Insta poll or Insta date, then you can lead source for the future. And I've got some stories that I can share with that too. So with the airport game, really, it started off that I was on a streak of getting sat next to hot chicks, got to the point where I could arrange to meet up with them in the city, or if I was getting off in a city and that was just a layover for them, keep the conversation going and facilitate a meetup in the future. And I found that, like, as a lead generation source, those convert very high for me. And I have a couple ideas as to possibly why that we can get into in this conversation. And then from there, just expanded that to, okay, if I'm walking through a terminal and there's, or the other day, I've had like 20 flights in the last 30 days, which is why it's a timely topic. There's a girl in the food court and I was waiting for my order. I always use my last name because most people screw up my first name. It's like, hey, Scott. And she was staring at me and she was like doing some IOIs, twirling the hair. And, you can feel people's presence upon you. It's like when you're driving, do this, like, just look out the window and stare at the side of someone's head, and they feel your gaze on them. So it was one of those things. I could feel that her gaze was on me and that it was a good gaze, not like, oh, he's got shit on his lip or something. So I went and got my food, and I'm like, oh, good choice, burger restaurant. I think we were in Europe somewhere. Like, oh, burger restaurant. We're in like Italy, and she got a little giggle out of that. And I'm like, hey, get your food and let's go eat together. And then just struck up a conversation. Turns out that our travel itineraries didn't match up, but that's a girl I'm still texting, not a lot, but every now and then, a couple of days she'll pop in and say something like, oh, I'm back at home now, back to normal life. I'm like, oh, me too. How you readjusting and stuff like that. But I'm already seeding a potential future meetup. And I got quite a few leads like that in Europe. So yes, you can pull at the airport. I've got some stories for that. If the logistics are lined up correctly, or if like the stars align, so to speak. But also, it's just a really good way to get new leads in the rotation. And I found personally that those usually convert over the longer term a lot higher.
Yep. No, that makes sense. And I think what's so great about it is it's also a lot of practice. When you're doing that. So a lot of guys, when we talk like day game, like we were talking about in the other episode, they're like setting time to like out of their day to go and approach women. Well, you're slotting it in and you're practicing those conversational skills when you got nothing else to do anyways. And
Yep.
I think that that's great. That's one thing I really enjoy about it. And then also keeping in mind that when people are traveling, well, I guess I should say this first. Airports are not the most exciting places. So if
Exactly that. You have a captive audience.
so if you're, let's say a lot of people are traveling for business, for them it's just routine. So when you bring that spark of excitement, they really enjoy it. And then also, if somebody is traveling for pleasure, they're much more receptive because they're already in a good mood. It's a win-win no matter why somebody is traveling.
Exactly. They're in that mindset because I know there's been times in my life where I've traveled a lot for business, where I've traveled for pleasure. I did a lot of traveling the last month. I'm just now getting back into my routine. And when I was on the road, so I assume the girls having a similar end user experience is what I call it as I was, where I looked at my phone, I'd get notifications on Instagram or WhatsApp or whatever from people in my day-to-day life here in Mexico City, but I saw the notifications coming in, but my mind was somewhere else. I was on the other side of the world. I was exploring, I was seeing new things, taking in the sights, smells, and sounds, and I was with my brother who I don't get to see that often. So I was in a different thought space at that time, to where my life was this like cloudy, like way out there image in my head. Now I'm back into it. It's like, boom, okay, here it is. Like I live here. But when I'm on the road, it's almost like an escape from your day-to-day life, the monotony, the I always say my life's not that sexy, really. You see the highlight reel on Instagram, but 95% of my days look exactly the same. And
Mhm.
it's a break from that. So when you meet a girl that's in that, I call them transitional spaces. I got that from like those like self-defense videos. I got into that a couple of years ago. They always say like, oh, it's a lot of times you're more susceptible to an attack when you're in a transitional space, like a parking lot, or you're not paying attention and you're fiddling for your keys, those types of spaces. So I found that when you enter transitional spaces, you're not really firmly rooted in your day-to-day life. So you're more open, receptive, maybe even susceptible, and that might be the wrong word, to have new experiences. And then I also talk about crafting narratives. So I shared a story with you. I met a girl in the Dead Sea. I was doing like the mud bath. It was like kind of spiritual, rejuvenating, and like that mud makes your skin like brand new. It's awesome. So there's some older Hispanic ladies, and they were only speaking Spanish. Like, oh, like where do you find the mud? Where do you get it? And you gotta like kind of get down in there and like scoop it up. Otherwise, the shores are real rocky. But once you find a mud patch, you can scoop it up. So I was like the mud guy. I was giving mud to like all these older Hispanic ladies, and this Israeli girl comes up and she's like, hey, like. And then she's like, hey, you missed a spot. And like started rubbing me. It's like, oh, you too. Started rubbing her stomach. Everyone in Israel is super fit. So like nice flat stomach, like nice, fully developed woman. Let's say that. So I started rubbing her. She started rubbing me. And then eventually like we took some pictures and then we went and showered off together. And she's like, hey, like I'm staying in Jerusalem. Where are you? I'm like, oh, I'm in Tel Aviv. Oh, let's try to meet up. When do you leave? Like tomorrow morning. Like, oh, damn it. So logistics were off. But I've been going back and forth with her. Turns out she has a wedding here in Mexico City in a couple months. And then I mentioned to you, she lives in Chicago. I'm like, all right, well, when I go on Trip's show live in studio, I'll just stay with her. So been continuing that conversation. And we've been having those talks like, oh, I'm back in my daily life. She's a doctor in Israel, but she spends a lot of her time in the US too. So she has a place in both countries, and trying to facilitate that meetup. But it stemmed from that narrative, like this experience, this once in a lifetime experience in the Dead Sea. Here's this guy, and we like gave each other mud baths and like rejuvenated our skin and our souls and all that stuff. She's not getting that from her day-to-day dopamine dump of just tender
Mhm.
pixels on the screen. And I'm a big advocate for online game, but these real life interactions, that is a story that she will remember forever. Even if nothing happens from it, she'll always wonder like, what happened to that guy from the Dead Sea? Because it was it was almost like a magical type moment. And then it just so happens that she bumped into me in that moment and we got to share that very small slice of time together. So I think that's very impactful too, in terms of the narrative that's playing out in her head.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And even so with me, I I didn't do a lot of lead generation necessarily, and I've never slept with a girl I met at the airport. I've only made out with women at the airport. But even that in and of itself, it's a story. So for example, I was down this is the first time I went to Miami. It was for a job interview in college, and there was a girl that I thought was like super cute, but we were like rapid through interviews throughout the day, so didn't really have time to talk to her. And then afterwards, when we were all going back, we all got like shuttled to the airport together, and both of our flights were around the same time. So I was like, "Hey, let's go grab a drink." And so we did. We started to hit it off, and then before we parted ways, we ended up making out right there in the airport. And dude, this girl was gorgeous, and that was I was on like cloud nine after doing that. And I don't think either of us got the job. So when you think about like, okay, I had to do this whole trip, go down, do all these stressful interviews, and didn't get the job. But what she's always going to remember is that time she spent with me in that airport.
Well, we talk a lot about. I know Joel's not here. He's traveling, having a good time out there in Europe, as he should, because summer's over quick out there, and it gets really cold really fast, especially where he's at. But he introduces the addiction type topics, and I always view, like, you can view addiction from multiple perspectives. But for me, it's that dopamine hit, it's that chemical rush, and it's an element of escapism. So I always look at, again, in that case with you, like I'm sure you prepared for the job interview, you're excited for it, maybe a little nervous, maybe you like rehearsed your questions, you practice handshaking with your dad or your buddy or whatever, like you were ready to go. And she likely did the same thing. So a lot of times job interviews are competitive, but being both in that similar kind of frame, and then pulling each other out of that to escape in that very small fraction of time, or that lapse of time, to be able to create that experience for her. By contrast, I always say too, like make women feel good emotions. Well, you have to understand like what her baseline operating core emotion is. A lot of times they're stressed out. They live pretty boring lives like we do. Like they don't really know where they're going. I've talked to a couple of girls recently that I've hung out with, and they all use terms like, "Hey, I'm kind of lost," or like, "My life's good, and I don't know what's next or what I want to do, and I'm kind of at odds with myself." So understand that they're having a human experience too. And if you can meet them at that level and then pull them out of that just for the time being, and then give them that hit, that dopamine rush, that, as an addict would call it, that fix, then I think that has a very powerful effect on her also.
Absolutely. Yeah, that definitely is what it was. And you'll get that a lot, like at airports, especially if you're talking to somebody who's traveling for business. They're stressed out about a lot of different things. Maybe they're going to an important meeting, or they're coming back from a very stressful meeting. And that is a perfect time to start up an adventure like that.
Or a lot of times too, there's a job I had years ago, and I was doing a lot of speaking engagement. So I was on the road for a good portion of the year. And I noticed that I was never like the keynote speaker. I was still pretty early in my career, but like I do breakout sessions, and I could get a few hundred people in a room. So that was nice. And usually once I get in front of a crowd, I'm kind of slow to start. And then when you have that real time feedback, so kind of like when you're gaming a girl and you just kind of shoot your shot, and then you see she's into you, and then it creates a positive feedback loop, and it builds the energy naturally. Well, imagine that with like 300 to 500 people. So you can hold an audience for an hour, have them on the edge of their seats. I always break it up. So I have like little activities. So I'll get them to stand up. I'll get them engaged and make sure that I keep that momentum going throughout the speech, and then ultimately end to sell them or pitch my product on the very last slide. But that's what I did at that time for a couple of years of my career. And I always noticed that at the event venue, and a lot of times as a speaker, they'll actually set you up at the hotel where the event's being held, where the conference room is. So any of those like mixer events or any like hotel bars, even the night before, I learned early in my career, don't drink the night before a speech. But the night after, especially after they've already seen you, usually that's pretty prime too. And I realized that job I was working, we were selling child nutrition software to an industry which is like lunch ladies, but they have different levels. They have like administrator levels that they can actually make some pretty good money. And I learned very quickly 95% of the industry was female. A lot of them, you had a lot of single moms there. A lot of them were older, like empty nesters, like 45 to 55, maybe even 65 years old. But a lot of them, these trips, they did these conferences at a state level, and I'd get invited to speak at them. This was their vacation. So yeah, they were going there for work. Yeah, they had to do the breakout sessions. They have to do like continuing education credits for like certain levels. So I had to get my speeches certified by the SNA, which is the School Nutrition Association. And they'd go and like check this off to meet their training requirements. But also there were events at night, and there were fun things to do. And they treated it a lot of times like a vacation. If you're from like small town rural Texas and you get to go to Houston, like especially West Texas, Texas is further away from Texas than it is from California. A lot of people don't realize that. So you'd get these like, lunch ladies, for lack of a better term, they'd come to Houston and like, they're ready to have fun. And then all of a sudden here's this guy, like a lot of the content's really boring. Here's this young guy who's like, relatively attractive, in pretty good shape. And he was able to captivate the audience, and you're just at a bar, and they'll come up and talk to you, and they'll actually shoot their shot too. So not even necessarily airport game, but any sort of travel in general. It kind of depends on the experience she's looking for. That works to a degree with bachelorette parties too. Like those are always fun groups, but I've found a lot of times that you end up kind of chasing them on this wild ride. Like they're in this like party mode, like a group of women, and they usually get pretty stupid. They get pretty like, for me, it used to be fun, but now it's like, oh, I got to like chase these drunk chicks around all night, and then usually end up having to babysit one, or there's drama or whatever. But still, like when you're traveling, you run into these sorts of situations, and you're also in a temporary escape from your day-to-day boring life, just as they are. And I think it's the context really that makes it such an effective practice to get good at airports or train stations or cute girls next to you on the flight or the train or public transportation or going to conferences or events. But I know you've traveled a lot for your job. Have you noticed that, like hotel conferences, like the bar or the mixer, and then usually if it's like a group mixer, and then afterwards people will break out into smaller groups, and you'll got other bars around the area, that usually that's pretty clutch too, for at least having opportunities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And at the very least, it doing stuff like that gets you in that conversational state, so that if you do meet somebody else who's not a coworker or whatever, it's going to be a lot easier to hit it off with them because you had already been spending time with so many other people. I think that's great. Another thing I wanted to mention, just going back to the airport thing, just because I was thinking about it, I don't want to lose it. So when we talk about night game, and this has been pushed out over and over and over again, take her to multiple venues. So when you first meet her, then you move to a different bar or different place, and you're bringing her on that journey. It builds the comfort, and it adds to the excitement and intrigue of the night. Now, when you're in an airport or train station or anything like that, it's the same type of thing. So let's say you're having a drink somewhere, and then, oh, you want to go grab a bite to eat at this place or that place. And then if you're killing time, especially if you have a delay on your flight, you can hit like 2, 3, multiple places with this girl, and you're essentially practicing exactly what you would do in night game, just at a different location. And I'd say that it's twice as successful because you are in that transient environment.
Yeah, and then here's one too. So I mentioned the pre-show. I hung out with a girl yesterday. I had a couple of girls actually hit me up. They're like, "Hey, I have a long layover. I have to stay the night here in Mexico City. Don't really know anyone. Don't know where to stay. Like, never been here before. What do I do? Any recommendations?" And one of the girls, I was like, "Hey, just at like 9 or 10 p.m." She's like, "Hey." I was talking to her for a couple of days back and forth, and she's like, "Hey, I really want to hang out with you, but I don't have a lot of time left in town. And I'm like looking for a hotel, and I'm really stressed out." And I told her, just come to my place. Like, I have a nice place. Like, even if you come over and we don't vibe, like, I've got an extra room. I've got a giant couch. Like, just let's just keep it chill. Don't be stressed out. Come over. We'll rest. Decompress, de-stress for the day, and then get a good night's sleep and be on your flight in the morning. And so that's how I kind of framed it. She eventually came over. We ended up hooking up very, very quickly. And then this morning we woke up early and had like a really good conversation. And she mentioned this. She said, "Hey, like with you, she's like, I normally don't do this. I was in a relationship for 8 years. Guys that have followed like red pill or manosphere topics, you know exactly what that means." She's like, "Hey, I don't have a lot of time off." She works in the medical industry. She's like, kind of wanted to find myself. I'm Hispanic, but I've never known Mexico outside of like resorts before. So I wanted to go to Mexico City, the heart of it, and just kind of explore for a bit before she has to go up north with her family, and then she's back in the U.S. after that. So she's like, "Hey, I have very little time here. My hotel reservation got screwed up. I spent all afternoon. I wanted to kind of explore the city, looking for hotels. Still can't find anything. Like, I'm lost. I don't really understand. Like, it's like I'm Hispanic and I speak Spanish, but like you don't learn like the lay of the land until you've lived in a place for a bit." So that worked out for her. I was like, "Yeah, just come stay with me." And she kept trying to like, I might have to show this as a field report, my private community, but she kept kind of second guessing herself. Like, "I don't know, this is the craziest thing I've done. I don't do this." And I'm like, "No, you're good. Like, you're fine." She's like, "Oh," she did the like, "Oh, what if you're a serial killer?" I was like, "Well, I was like, I'm gonna roll a joint. Like, I'm gonna be too lazy to like fucking kill anyone. So like, don't worry about that." Like, and then I use like we were speaking in Spanish at that point, so I use Spanish slang like, "Oh, me da hueva matarte," and she's like, "Oh, okay, yeah, it's kind of funny." And so that gets past that objection real quick, and then came over and again we hooked up really quick because I think because at the time I was like, okay, like she's obviously into it, overcame the objections. When you can tell a lot of times, like when you first physically meet someone in person, the minute she came in the door, she was like, whoa. And she told me this morning too, she's like, I never do this. She's like, but she's like, I'm going to break in my relationship. Recently dumped my boyfriend. He's not really going anywhere. And I don't know, but I kind of want to get back because it's a safe option, but I kind of want to explore myself. Like I'm kind of lost right now. And she's like, and she told me this morning, she's like, I just thought you were so hot that I had to go for it. I'm like, good. So that's why sex happened very quickly, because we know in this, if there's genuine burning desire, then a lot of that anti-slut defense goes away. It doesn't even exist. If one, she thinks you have like the look, two, when you're in person, you have the vibe, and then you frame everything correctly. But main point being, this morning, she told me, she's like, normally I wouldn't do this. I'd take time to get to know you. I'm actually pretty, she was in a relationship for 8 years. So yeah, women lie about this stuff all the time, but to a degree, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Like coming out of an 8-year committed relationship to all of a sudden being by yourself, like the dating game has changed so much in 8 years that she probably didn't know what to expect. But she told me this morning, she's like, you intrigued me by text. She's like, I stalked the shit out of you on Instagram. She mentioned the content too. She's like, oh, I saw some of the videos. They're like, oh, who the hell's this douche? But I was intrigued by you. And that's a key one too. She's like, I don't know. She's like, I just thought you're really hot and I had to meet you for whatever reason. And then this morning she told me, like a lot of times guys screw up. Like they'll get into the player lifestyle and they'll like pump and dump chicks. And they're like, hey, why doesn't she come back? Or why doesn't she stay in the rotation? And it's because they have buyer's remorse, because they didn't like build that comfort afterwards. So after the conversation this morning, she confessed before she left. She's like, hey, I thought I was going to regret this. She's like, but you're really deep. You're really interesting. I really actually like you as a person. So I'm like, okay, she won't have buyer's remorse now. But the key thing was, she's like, again, normally wouldn't do this, but she said there was a sense of urgency. And I think that like the airport game, you're on a condensed timeline. So if you're in between layovers, yeah, maybe you have an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, but you got to shoot your shot and just move that conversation forward, because what else are you going to do? And then the worst thing she does is say no, and she's going to sit there bored at the terminal, and you're going to sit there bored at the terminal. So a lot of times, and then it's safe too. You're in a public place. So with that sense of urgency, I think you can drive the interaction forward a lot quicker than you would if you're just, again, in your day-to-day boring normal life.
Yeah, no, 100% would agree with you on that. That's what makes it just so much fun. Like, as you said, yeah, if she says no, then she's going to sit there bored, and then you're going to sit there bored. So people are a lot more receptive when they're in that type of environment. So I love that. And then what you had said before that I found interesting is with the stewardesses. So because a lot of times, depending on when your flight is, that the stewardesses may be going back to where they live, you can hit it up with them and then move something like that forward if you're in the same location.
Yeah. So I actually dated a stewardess for a few months here, and she was based in Mexico City. She goes all over the place. So, and they work really weird schedules. Contact hours. So a lot of times she runs her life kind of the way I run mine. Like I group everything, I block everything. So if I'm doing sales calls, I'm going to block them back to back to back. So I don't like task switching. And then after each one, you kind of get the momentum going, and it's easier just to knock it all out at once. And then that allows me larger blocks of free time to do other things in my life. So she kind of structured her schedule that way. And that was really nice because I run a flexible schedule and she does too. And then when she was in town, and it's a really stressful job. You deal with the general public and all the time zone changes, and you're constantly on the go. And I think earlier in the conversation, it's like, oh, you're a stewardess, you probably have like a guy in every town. She's like, you know what? A lot of people think that. She's like, we're so tired when we get in that we just hit the hotel and crash. And then they're required to rest a certain amount of hours, and they're back in the air the next day. So she's like, yeah, contrary to popular belief, she's like, not so much, but they are receptive to that type of stuff. So in my head, I'm like, oh, I'm probably just a Mexico City guy. There's probably cities she flies to frequently. She has other guys, whatever, just keep it as it is. But I know in Europe, I got the phone number from a couple of stewardesses. They weren't staying in the city where my destination was. And you asked that logistically. Oh, hey, like, oh, this is a cool airline. I've never flown here before. Oh, where's it based out of? Oh, Romania. Oh, cool. Like we're in Tel Aviv now. Like, are you going to stay in Israel? Like, nope, going right back the same exact route we flew, and I'll be back home in my bed in Romania tonight. I'm like, oh, cool. I've got some guy friends in Romania. I need to make it out there at some point. Are you in the capital? Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. Exchange information. She sees my stories on Instagram. I see hers. Drop a text here and there. Like, we're not going to meet up anytime soon. But if someday I'm in Romania, in her mind, there's that timeline. So like, it's not like, so if you look at the like actual strings of text, maybe we've only volleyed back and forth like 50 texts over the course of 6, 7, 8 months, whenever the hell I make it out to Romania. But there's that time factor. She's like, oh, I've been talking to this guy for 8 months now. And again, that kind of reduces the friction in her meeting up, because it feels like they're more invested, although they're sporadic texts every few weeks or a few months. So I've noticed that works too. I got a number from a stewardess, Romanian, when we landed in Tel Aviv, and then my brother very quickly caught into the game, so he was hitting up all the stewardesses too, and he's like, hey bro, like I was trying to get her number, and like some of the flights they'd separate us, like, hey, you're sitting closer up, so like tell her, like, he's like, get a pen, like give her my information, and like, like me kind of winging for him, slip it to her. But a lot of these stewardesses, so some of them are like actual really easy, like they get into that career because they have that personality type. They need those new dopamine hits, like, ooh, new guy, new city, new country, new language. And yes, they will do that. But a lot of them, they work pretty hard too. And like, hey, it's hard for them to have real relationships because, like I said, when you're on the road, you're not only physically in a new place, but mentally you're in a new place too. Like for me, when I was on the other side of the world, Mexico was this foreign idea in my head, and I didn't even really think about it. There's Mexicans in Europe, they speak Spanish around there, but like when you start getting into the Middle East, there's no more Spanish anymore. There's not even really English anymore. You don't see a lot of people that look like me we went to Palestine. So like, you don't see a lot of guys like me. And so it's so far removed from your head, but then when you come back to it, it's nice to know, like, oh, I have my friends here, I have my girls here, I have somewhat of a structure in my life. And understanding after dating the stewardess for a bit, like, okay, I was that for her, like the idea, or like kind of the simulation of a quote unquote real relationship when she's back in her normal life and she's not in the air living these new experiences and having all this stress and adjusting at the time changes and being running on fumes. So that's very important to keep in mind too. And I always call that, understand what her end user experience is with you. And I found that knowing that, getting to know this girl well enough to know what her day-to-day lifestyle looks like how stewardesses operate, asking all the funny questions, like, do people bang in the planes? She's like, no, actually not that much, because those bathrooms are really fucking dirty. Especially on these Mexican flights. Mexicans do not like public restrooms. They fucking trash them. So like, they're disgusting. I could not imagine banging in one of those. So, you ask the interesting questions, but you understand what her life looks like. What does the life of a stewardess look like? And then you can frame the conversation to bring her out of that life into yours, or yours to a degree into her life as well.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that. Now, I got a question for you. How do you keep track of all of these different women in all these different countries to move those things forward? Like, as you said, like with Romania, like you're going to shoot a couple texts like every couple months or something, and you may not see her for a year. How do you balance all that? Because I'm sure you're generating a ton of leads all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm using my phone as a webcam right now. Yeah, these iPhones are good. They zoom and focus so quick. But so I have a way. So for example, let's say I meet her on Tinder. I put a flame. I put the country. So like Tinder, Mexico. And then I do, if she's a girl that doesn't flake, enthusiastically, we hook up, no issues, no rescheduling things. Like she's communicative, responsive to text. She gets a green check mark. She gets a green X mark if she's harder to meet up with, but she comes through and like still puts out. She gets like a yellow caution sign if it's kind of like, all right, this girl's a pain in the ass. She flakes all the time. She never hangs out, or it's hard to schedule her. Like she doesn't come through on her word. But if she hits you up and she's like, hey, what are you doing? I'm in the neighborhood. She's down to come over and hang out. So I call those the text me when you're free in the moment, and if I'm free too, we can meet up type girls. So that's like the yellow caution sign. And then every now and then, which in my life, thank God this doesn't happen often, but you get like the crazy chicks. So that's like a red, like the red negative sign. And that's for, if anything comes up like, oh, this guy did something to me, as I'm getting more public. If something comes up in the future, oh, this guy's terrible, he abused me, he did whatever, like, all right, I have a text record of that. I have the conversation there. So little things I tell girls, like, send me a good night text when you get home. I want to know you made it home safely. And usually like, oh my God, I had such a good time. I haven't felt like that way in a long time. Oh, it was fantastic. I can't wait to see you again. Boom. That's a text record. So if anyone's like, oh, he coerced me or I regret it, I'm like, well, here's that. So I do keep like the negative interactions too, really just as kind of an official record or repository. So that's how I manage the contacts. And then usually I batch my text messages. So even for my guy friends, like for yours, I think I have like a camera on there because because we're working together in a creative capacity. You have a green check mark on there because you're responsive. You schedule me, you're on the call, I'm on the call. So for those, like when I get notifications all day long, but I can just look up here in my monitor. I have all my apps open on the desktop version, so I can see like camera green check mark and know like, oh, I should probably respond to that immediately. But if I see, flame Mexico flag green check mark, those girls will get responded to when I'm done at this task. Maybe if I'm task switching, so I'm doing sales calls or I'm doing administrative work, and then I have half an hour before a live stream. And, I'm in the green room. I'm waiting, maybe it'll take 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes. Then I'll go through and respond to those girls. Any of like the yellow caution signs, I'll get to those when I can. Any of the red ones, I never respond to those. So I kind of have like a methodology to categorize or prioritize people, not just girls, but people in general with to whom I give my attention. And that seems to work pretty well for me, because otherwise, if you're constantly, and this can get addicting too, ding, 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 and you get that dopamine hit, like, ooh, someone loves me, someone wants to work with me, ooh, a girl might want to hook up with me, ooh, she thinks I'm attractive, then you'll find you're wasting a lot of time. Like it takes you out of what you're doing, and then it takes you time to get back into the primary task you should be doing. So for me, that's more of kind of a pragmatic way of looking at it, and more of me managing my energy and my focus correctly. But there is an exception to that. Like if I know that I'm meeting a girl, let's say at like 5 p.m. and it's 4:30 and I see, boom, she pops up. Okay, we're talking logistics at that point. So I'll go ahead and get on that message. But I've already kind of mentally blocked that time out for me, knowing that, okay, as the time approaches, she'll be like, hey, where do I park? Or, hey, can I get an Uber? Is there traffic? Or can I stay the night? Or, hey, I got to get out early. Or maybe I'm caught up at work. Can I come an hour later? Is that cool? All right. So those kind of messages occur. But when it's just like the girls that you meet passively while you're traveling, the cool thing is there too, opposite of the comment where when you're in the airport, or like the girl I met yesterday, sense of urgency. In this case, there's not a sense of urgency. So you don't have to get back to her immediately. You see that she texted you, get back to her at some point, and then guess what? She'll get back to you at some point too. Now, if you're if you're making plans together to meet up, like she's coming to my city, like the Israeli doctor I mentioned, as that date approaches, we will be texting more back and forth, because we'll be getting more into logistics in terms of like, what do I do when I get to the airport? How do I get to your place? How do I get up? Like, what's the lay of the land? What do I need to know to facilitate this in-person meetup? Or we met initially in person, so like this grand reunification. But if it's just really lead nurturing or management, there's no sense of urgency to get back and constantly be responsive, because remember, you started off as an escape from her day-to-day life. So she's likely in her day-to-day life most of the time. And then when she has a chance, she'll get back to the text message, and she can tap back into that fantasy and then give life to it on her own time. She kicks the message back to you. Same thing. I'm in my day-to-day life. I'm busy. I have a million messages. I have a million emails. But there are periods where I'm like, I'm kind of done for the day. It's time to unwind. Then I'll look through like, oh yeah, here, I'll text this chick back. She was super cool. Or, oh, I'll text this girl back. And that's kind of how I manage it.
I love that. So where did you learn that? Because that's brilliant to put it like that in your phone, so that like off the bat, because it becomes so overwhelming, especially I know when I was really, really heavy going through dates on Hinge, and it was constant.
Yep.
I love that. But where did you just come up with it yourself, or?
Yeah, I work in marketing as a career at like the corporate level. So I've been doing marketing consulting for one of the big four for the last 3 years. And when you get in to a client CRM or marketing automation system, you start to see things. It depends on the system. So I think, for example, Pardot, which is the major marketing automation system owned by Salesforce, it plays nicely with Salesforce, but sometimes, it requires a degree of some like technical architecture, engineering background based on how big your build is or your instance is. But I worked primarily in Pardot since I was the director of the marketing team in a couple roles ago. And you get to a point where at the campaign level, you have to do what's called lead scoring. And essentially Pardot back in the day, I haven't used it in a bit, so they might have changed it, but they have different flames. So you set your criteria as far as like, okay, subscribes to an email. That's like 10% weight, and it gives them this much boost on their score. And then opens 3 of the last 5 emails, or has logged into the platform in the last 30 days. And you can go through and weight what that means from like a lead scoring perspective. When you're a newer company, a lot of times it's like, hey, anyone that opens an email, send us the lead list. Sales is going to get on the phone. We're going to do like an outbound call type campaign. When you start working with more volume, sales doesn't have that capacity. So you have to go on the marketing side and start adjusting the lead scoring mechanisms to know. Here's a good example. We did a product launch for that K through 12 startup company software company I worked for years ago. And we did like a webinar series. We had a weekly podcast. We had a weekly newsletter. We had 5 blogs a week, Monday through Friday. We did speaking engagements. We had like our lead gen forums. So there were people, and if they play it right, this can happen, where like they'd call me and they're like, "Hey, are you the webmaster?" Like, "Yeah, what's up?" Like, I've gotten like 10 emails in the last 5 days from you guys. I feel like you're spamming us. And I look at their contact record in the CRM, which is customer relationship management system. CRM. And you look at it, you're like, well, you signed up for a webinar, so you got all the webinar invites, you got the webinar reminder, you got the webinar replay, you downloaded an ebook, so you got the ebook download link, you got the thanks for downloading, you got put on like an automated marketing email, you clicked through all those emails, so you kept getting scored higher as a lead. So that's why, like, the more you interact with us, the system's designed so the more you're going to get from us. Now, at that point, obviously, that's someone who's a layup for sales. Anyone that knows like sales or marketing. If you watch a webinar and you download an ebook and then you do like an automated group demo and then you fill out a form and you have additional questions about the project, the system knows to kick that to sales immediately and then put that on the top of the sales lead list. Like, this person gets priority for you to follow up with because they've indicated they're interested in what we have to offer. So that's how my brain works based on what I do for a living in my professional life. And I think that just kind of spilled over to my dating life because I always say my forte is online dating. Yes, I don't do dedicated day gaming sessions, but when I go out and I get IOIs, indicators of interest, I always shoot my shot. I always open, and I usually do pretty damn well. But from like the way my brain has been created or structured based on what I do for a living, I believe that spilled over into my online dating life because I realized like, oh, this is just a marketing funnel. Yeah, you don't have like all the automation that you would for like a major enterprise level installation of like a big automation tool, but you learn some of the things like, okay, I'm dealing with all these leads. A lot of times, like, you'll schedule chicks, you'll forget who they are. So you got to take detailed notes, and then you need a scoring system. So the scoring system works well for me. It's very rudimentary, but I don't want to spend a lot of time managing this stuff. So if I see a girl, we have a good time. I see that, I see the Mexico flag, green check mark pops up. And I'm like, okay, cool. The green check mark's there. It indicates like I've never had any issues with her. I can just be like, hey, what's up? Great to hear from you. Let's meet up. When are you free? She'll set a time. She won't flake. She'll come through. And for me, those women get priorities. Just like the example, the person who downloaded the ebook and watched the webinar and attended a group sales demo and filled out the lead form. And I have more questions about this specific feature. Same exact thing to me in my brain. So that's where I got it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that. And I would I'm gonna play around with it myself, but I would recommend that is a gem. I would recommend all guys start to set things up that way because that takes so much off your plate. You always know who you're talking to, or you always know what that experience is going to be like. It just helps manage your time because we all know time is the most valuable resource. So I think that's great. Well, anyways, Jaren, I know we talked about a lot of great things here. Is there any final thoughts that you have on the topic that you want to share?
Yeah, I think let's just sum up some of the main points. So, guys, these are kind of new. I like the red pill topics. I like the game topics, but I think a lot of them are really rudimentary. You get these dogmatisms. So like, never double text or never do this. And I would say never speak in absolutes in response to any of those kinds of questions. So there's different layers. There's different levels to this. Some of them may work for you. Some of them may not. I'm very analytical. I'm very system structured. I do work as a digital marketing consultant in my professional career. So that influences the way I approach game because that's naturally how I think. So keep that in mind for yourself. But some of the takeaways are transitional spaces. Use that to your advantage. Passive audiences. That's why I think airports, train stations, even if you're on a flight, we didn't get into it, but I've met girls that have, we kind of touched tip of the iceberg there, but I've met girls sitting next to me on a flight. They're into me, like captive audience. You have a 3-hour flight. Guess what? You can have a 3-hour conversation. And for me, it hasn't been uncommon to where eventually we put up the armrest and the girl's just kind of laying on my shoulder when you open her up, and you're able to build that comfort because contrary to popular belief, like the airplane bathrooms, they're barely big enough for me. So like, you're probably not going to bang her on the flight unless, you're into, dirty airplane bathroom sex. So you're able to start to you're able to move the stage of the interaction around. You can build that comfort, build that suspicion. hey, where are you going? Like, we're on a flight from Mexico City to Tijuana. Oh, I'm going to San Diego for a week with my buddies, and we're going to go to a music festival, and then I'm going to come back. But but when I come back, I'm going to spend a night in Tijuana and then catch the red-eye flight out. What are you doing? Oh, I live in Tijuana. I was in Mexico City visiting my uncle. I might want to live there someday. I'm like, well, cool. Let's get a drink on my night in Tijuana. Like, I'll only have one or two because I have an early morning flight, and we can talk about, having you come back down there. And if you want, you can stay with me. I'll show you around. I have a good social life here. I live a very good life, and kind of seed that future meetup. So these are some of the reasons why these things can be so powerful, because you have the captive audience, you have the sense of urgency or lack of urgency. You're in a transitional space. She's in a moment, in a very small fragment of time in her mental real estate, to where she's in a lapse of fantasy. Really, she's not firmly footed in her day-to-day life. When she and I are in the air and there's no cell phone coverage, she's not worried about what her mom's going to think or what about her dad's going to think. None of her friends are there to judge her. It's a plane full of strangers. It's usually boring as hell. The seats are uncomfortable. It's stressful. Do I take my shoes off? Do I not take my shoes off? Don't take your laptops out. Sorry, I've had 20 flights in the last 30 days. Half of them you take your laptop out, half of them you don't. New country, new laws, I get it. Like, all of those things are stressful. So like, you can kind of take her on, just remove her from that and bring her into your frame, and you have no competition. The reason I don't like night game a lot, unless I do it a very certain way, like showing up to the club with my own girls, is because you're competing for the attention of the lights and the sounds and the sparklers going off for the birthdays and the woo-woos and the chicks here in Mexico blowing whistles as they're like giving you shots out of their tits, and the DJ. There's so much stimuli that you have to compete with all of that. On the airplane, there's none of that at all. So keep these things in mind in terms of transitional spaces, sense of urgency, lack of urgency, context, having the captive audience, removing her from her day-to-day monotony of life, and then creating that fantasy and then feeding that fantasy, either closing on the short term if logistics permit, or feeling that fantasy to seed a future meetup. I believe those are all things that are powerful, especially when it comes to airplane game or transitional spaces, but they're things that maybe you can apply to your day-to-day game or just life in general also.
Right. No, that's great. Absolutely. And then I love what you were saying. I just got to say it again. I love what you were saying about organizing, because I'm probably going to do something like that. There's green check marks, the yellow, the red. Just a great way to kind of manage that in your own life. So that's awesome.
And also, too, what I say on that, it helps you weed out the chicks that aren't serious, so they don't waste your time and energy. But also, it keeps you from overlooking girls that are good. Because I've had that happen before. Like, a girl, you'll rematch with a girl on Tinder. She reaches out, like, oh, hey, here's standard lines. Here's my WhatsApp. Here's my Instagram. I had a girl the other day, and she's like, Jaren? And I was like, oh, no, what's up? She's like, we hooked up like 2 years ago, and then he never texted me ago. I was like, give me your number. And I looked at the number. I didn't save the contact. And I looked at the thread, and I'm like, oh, this girl is really cool. Like, like, it re-jogged my memory. It's like, oh, I really liked this girl. Yeah, why didn't I text her back? And then I was looking, I think it was like 2 years ago. I think I was traveling home for the holidays. So again, Mexico's not on my mind. My mind is like, what am I going to get my siblings for Christmas? Are we going to do Christmas presents? Like, who's cooking what for dinner? Oh, it's snowing. Do I have a car? Like, do I get a farm truck? Am I going to drive the old truck that my mom drove when I was in high school? My brother's going to be in town. Like, what's the car situation? All of these things are in my head. I'm not thinking about a girl I hooked up with 2 weeks ago. So that it helps you also not overlook girls that would be like something potentially quality for like longer term into the future as well.
No, that's great. Well, as we wrap up here, if you want to go ahead and plug your stuff, feel free.
Yeah, that sounds good. So guys, you're on the Men of Now channel. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, leave comments, all of that good stuff. If you want more of me, Huds and I are doing a lot of work together. I'll be getting on a lot more channels. I'll be having a lot more guys on my channel as well. Yes, I do have a channel. Instagram at Jaren Scott is the best place to go for that. You'll have access to all my links. Get on my channel. Same thing. Check out some content, like, subscribe, share with your friends, do all that stuff. Give me the engagement, give me the love. It's all free. Be sure to DM me if you need any one-on-one coaching. I do that. If you have any questions, we can go more in depth for a lot of these things. I'm very structured and systematic in my thinking. So I have a lot of really kind of like A to Z type rapid pace plans that I can put my guys on. Usually it only takes a call or two to like get these things figured out. And then once you have the framework built in, you can make it your own from there. If you want to go a level deeper, I also manage a group called the Top 10% Group. That is a group for like-minded men looking to level up in all areas of love and life by building lives worth living and loving. Yes, it's a mouthful. I finally got it. I'm getting back on my broadcasting game. And that is an extension of Rich Cooper's Top 1% Group. There's me and a handful of other admins. So we cover a breadth of knowledge, a breadth of topics. And I always say the value for these groups is other guys in the group. So we've gotten some really good new guys lately. We're doing workshops on how to automate your lifestyle, on minimalism. We have a divorce recovery one. We have overcoming traumatic life events. We had a guy that was in a motorcycle accident, has to recreate a new identity. That's really tough. My brother did that years ago. I got to watch in real time what that process looks like. So we have a lot of higher level, more in-depth stuff that is behind a paywall. There is a price point to that. But if you're looking, it's fun to listen to this content. It's entertaining. A lot of times guys live vicariously through us, like, oh, I can imagine my lifestyle like that. But if you really want to take that next step and start doing it, reach out to me personally, ask me any questions, book a one-on-one coaching session, or get into the group. And we have a lot of guys in there that are living a lot of interesting lives on their own terms, and jump into one of those workshops, start meeting guys, expand your network. And that's precisely what that group is for. So aside from that, yeah, hit me up, Jaren Scott on Instagram. Let me know what you need.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And then as always, if you want to reach out to me for anything, Instagram at the Hudsman, ask me a question. If you want to go through the link tree to sign up for a console, I would love to help. And then as for the Men of Now channel, we're going to continue doing this. Joel will be back once he's done traveling and goofing off, and we're gonna have a lot of interesting topics as we move along. And of course, if you have any questions or specific topics you would like us to talk about, definitely comment that down below, and we'll go ahead and address it. And then, as always, just make sure to subscribe, like, comment, share. Let's grow this together and create something amazing. But
yeah, share with your friends too. A lot of guys overlook that. Like, hey, check these guys out. They have pretty interesting conversations. You can start there too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you again, Jaren, for coming on and talking about this with me. And until next time, guys,